James Harrison had always believed that the rolling fields of his Virginia farm were untouchable, a sanctuary carved from 3 decades of sweat and love. The land was more than soil. It was his legacy, his children's future, and the heart of his identity. At 55, with calloused hands and a sun-weathered face, Jim drove his tractor through rows of corn, humming an old folk tune, the kind his grandfather sang. His wife, Elizabeth, Liz to everyone, stood on the porch of their modest farmhouse, her apron dusted with flour, waving him in for lunch. The air smelled of earth and promise. Their life was simple, deliberate, a counterpoint to the chaos of the modern world. But that morning, as the sun climbed high, a low rumble shattered the peace. Bulldozers and excavators roared to life at the edge of Jim's property, tearing through his fields like a predator through prey. Workers in neon vests swarmed, shouting orders, their machines ripping up the earth he'd nurtured. Jim slammed the tractor to a halt, his heart pounding, and sprinted toward the chaos. Standing there, clipboard in hand, was Richard "Dick" Thompson, the smug president of the neighboring Homeowners Association. With his tailored suit and slick smile, he looked like he'd never touched dirt in his life. "Mr. Harrison," Dick said, his voice dripping with condescension, "this is HOA business. We're building a private runway for our community. Your land borders ours and we have easement rights." Jim's blood boiled. Easement rights? He'd never signed off on anything like that. The HOA's gated community, a sprawl of McMansions, had been encroaching for years, their residents sneering at his rustic lifestyle. Now they were stealing his land for a runway? "This is my farm," Jim growled, fists clenched. Dick just smirked, waving a legal document. "Check your deeds, farmer boy. It's all legal." As the bulldozers continued their assault, Jim stood helpless, watching his legacy be torn apart. But Dick didn't know who he was dealing with. By day, Jim was a farmer, but by title, he was the director of the Federal Aviation Administration. And he wasn't about to let some suburban tyrant destroy his life's work without a fight. The audacity of the HOA's move was staggering. Jim had dealt with entitled bureaucrats before, but this was personal. The runway wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a violation, a deliberate act to erase his livelihood for the convenience of wealthy residents who wanted to jet off to their vacation homes. As he walked back to the farmhouse, his boots sinking into the churned-up soil, he replayed Dick's words in his mind. Easement rights? He'd inherited this land from his father, who'd inherited it from his father. Every acre was accounted for, every boundary marked. There was no way the HOA had legal grounds to do this, not without some serious underhanded maneuvering. Inside, Liz was waiting, her face pale. "What's happening, Jim?" she asked, her voice trembling. He told her everything, watching her eyes widen with each word. "They can't do this," she said, but Jim knew better. The HOA had money, lawyers, and connections. They thrived on bullying those they deemed beneath them. But Jim wasn't just any farmer. For years, he'd kept his 2 lives separate, the farmer who loved his land and the FAA director who wielded power over the skies. He'd taken the FAA job to protect rural communities like his own from the overreach of aviation projects. But he'd never imagined he'd need to turn that power on his own backyard. Sitting at the kitchen table, he pulled out his phone and dialed Sarah, his assistant at the FAA. "Sarah, pull every regulation on private airfields. Environmental, airspace, permits, everything." Sarah's voice crackled through the line, sharp and curious. "Boss, you sound pissed. What's going on?" Jim stared out the window at the bulldozers. "Just some pests building without permission." He hung up, a plan forming. The HOA thought they could steamroll him with their money and arrogance. They were about to learn that the skies belonged to him. Back in Washington, D.C., Jim's office at the FAA was a stark contrast to his farm. Polished floors, walls lined with aviation charts, and a desk buried under reports. He sat there the next morning, his farmer's overalls replaced by a crisp suit, his hands now clean but no less determined. Sarah, 30 and whip-smart, handed him a stack of files. "No environmental impact study, no airspace approval, no wildlife mitigation plan," she said, ticking off violations. "This HOA runway is a regulatory disaster." Jim's lips curled into a grim smile. "Good. Let's make it their disaster." As director of the FAA, Jim had overseen countless projects, from major airports to rural airstrips. He knew the rules backward and forward. Title 14 of the Code of Federal Regulations was his weapon, and he wielded it with precision. The HOA's runway was a blatant violation of Part 157, which required FAA notification for any new airfield. They hadn't filed a single form. Jim began drafting letters, each one a legal landmine. Cease and desist orders, demands for environmental studies, notices of fines. He wasn't just going to stop the runway. He was going to bury the HOA in their own bureaucracy. But he had to be careful. His dual life as a farmer and FAA director was a delicate balance. If the HOA discovered his position, they'd accuse him of abusing power. Let them try, he thought. They'd started this war. That evening, Jim attended an HOA meeting, blending in among the residents. The meeting hall was all polished wood and chandeliers, a shrine to suburban excess. Dick Thompson stood at the podium, preaching about how the runway would elevate property values and let residents jet to the Hamptons without traffic. The crowd, lawyers, CEOs and retirees with too much time, cheered. A woman named Karen Wilson, 60 and dripping with entitlement, raised her hand. "What about that farmer?" "He's complaining." Dick laughed, waving her off. "He's just noise. We'll bury him in paperwork." Jim, seated in the back, clenched his jaw. Then a courier arrived, handing Dick an envelope. The room fell silent as he opened it. From the FAA, Dick read aloud, his face paling. "Cease and desist, violation of Title 14, CFR Part 157. What is this nonsense?" Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Jim slipped out, unnoticed, his heart pounding with satisfaction. The HOA thought they could outmaneuver him with lawyers and loopholes. They didn't know he was playing chess while they played checkers. The next morning, FAA inspectors descended on the construction site like hawks. They measured distances, photographed violations, and cited everything from improper drainage to the runway's proximity to power lines. Dick arrived, red-faced, shouting at the workers to keep going. "On what grounds are you shutting us down?" he demanded. An inspector, stone-faced, handed him a document. "Orders from Director Harrison." Dick's eyes narrowed. "Harrison? That farmer is the FAA?" The realization hit him like a freight train. Jim wasn't just a stubborn farmer. He was the man who controlled the skies. Back at the farmhouse, Jim watched from a distance, sipping coffee. Liz joined him, her expression a mix of pride and worry. "Is this legal, what you're doing?" she asked. Jim met her gaze. "I'm enforcing the law." "They started it." His phone buzzed. "Dick." "Harrison, you think you can stop us with bureaucracy?" Dick's voice was venomous. "Who is this?" Jim asked, feigning innocence. "Thompson, HOA president. We know you're pulling strings at the FAA." Jim smirked. "Me? I'm just a farmer." He hung up, but Dick's words lingered. The HOA had connections, maybe even in D.C. Jim would need to move fast. At the FAA, Jim doubled down. He ordered a full audit of the HOA's community, digging into their financials, their permits, even their garbage collection contracts. Every violation, no matter how small, was ammunition. Sarah, ever loyal, worked late, pulling records. "These guys are dirty," she said, handing him a report. "Shell companies, unreported donations to local officials. This runway isn't just about jets, it's a money laundering front." Jim's eyes gleamed. The HOA wasn't just greedy. They were corrupt. He drafted more letters, this time to the EPA, the IRS, and the Department of Transportation. The runway was only the beginning. He'd dismantle their entire operation. But the HOA wasn't idle. Dick hired a team of lawyers, each one more expensive than the last. They filed injunctions, claiming the FAA was overstepping. Jim welcomed the challenge. He'd spent years navigating D.C.'s political swamp. A few suburban lawyers didn't scare him. The courtroom was a battlefield, all polished wood and stern faces. The HOA's lawyers, led by a shark named Evelyn Carter, argued that the runway was a community improvement and that Jim was abusing his FAA position to settle a personal grudge. Jim, represented by a friend from law school, stayed calm. He didn't need to argue emotion. The law was on his side. The judge, a no-nonsense woman named Clara Bennett, reviewed the documents. No FAA notification, no environmental studies, no permits, she said, her tone sharp. This project is a regulatory nightmare. Evelyn tried to pivot, claiming the HOA had implied consent from local authorities. Jim's lawyer countered with a stack of FAA regulations, each one a nail in the HOA's coffin. The judge issued a temporary injunction, halting construction. Dick in the gallery looked like he'd swallowed a lemon. Jim caught his eye and gave a slight nod, as if to say, "Checkmate." Back at the farm, the bulldozers were silent, but the damage was done. Acres of crops were gone, replaced by churned earth and concrete pilings. Liz walked the fields with Jim, her hand in his. "We'll replant," she said. "We always do." But Jim's mind was elsewhere. The HOA wouldn't stop. They'd regroup, find another loophole, or worse, dig into his life. He'd kept his FAA role quiet for years, not wanting the attention. Now it was out, and the vultures were circling. That night, he got a call from an old colleague, Senator Tom Reynolds. "Jim, you're stirring up a hornet's nest," Tom said. "The HOA's got friends in high places. Be careful." Jim thanked him but didn't back down. Careful wasn't his style, not when his land was at stake. He spent the night poring over regulations, looking for the knockout blow. Jim's next move was surgical. He requested a federal investigation into the HOA's finances, citing potential violations of interstate commerce laws tied to their private airfield. The IRS, eager for a high-profile case, jumped in. Agents raided the HOA's offices, seizing computers and files. Dick's smug demeanor cracked as the news hit. Residents, once loyal to him, started whispering. Karen Wilson, the HOA's loudest cheerleader, cornered Dick at a coffee shop. "You said this was a sure thing," she hissed. Dick brushed her off, but his confidence was slipping. Meanwhile, Jim worked with Sarah to map the HOA's airspace violations. The runway's proposed path cut through restricted airspace near a military base, a detail Dick's team had conveniently ignored. Jim sent a formal notice to the Department of Defense, knowing they'd take it seriously. The HOA was now fighting on multiple fronts, and they were losing. At home, Liz noticed the toll it was taking. Jim barely slept, his nights spent drafting letters or studying legal briefs. "You're obsessed," she said one evening, her voice soft but firm. "This isn't just about the farm anymore." Jim looked at her, his eyes tired but resolute. "It's about principle. They think they can take what's ours because they've got money. I'm showing them no one's above the law." Liz nodded, but her worry lingered. The HOA's next move came swiftly, a smear campaign. Local news ran stories about FAA director abusing power, painting Jim as a vindictive bureaucrat. Dick even leaked Jim's dual life to a tabloid, complete with photos of him on his tractor. Jim laughed it off, but the scrutiny stung. He was a private man, and now his life was a headline. Still, he pressed on, knowing the truth was on his side. The HOA community fractured. Some residents, fed up with Dick's arrogance, started questioning the runway. Others, loyal to the promise of luxury, doubled down. At a tense town hall, Dick tried to rally support, but the room was hostile. "You said this was legal," one resident shouted. "Now we're getting audited." Dick's promises of quick fixes fell flat. Jim, watching from the back, felt a flicker of hope. The HOA's unity was their strength, and it was crumbling. He met with a few defectors, offering them a deal, support his fight, and he'd ensure their properties weren't affected by FAA restrictions. Some agreed, tired of Dick's bullying. Others, like Karen, stayed loyal, calling Jim a tyrant in overalls. Back at the FAA, Jim escalated. He proposed a new airspace restriction over the HOA's community, citing safety concerns. The move would ground their private jets indefinitely. Sarah raised an eyebrow. "This is bold even for you." Jim shrugged. "They want to play dirty, I'll play dirtier." The proposal went to a public hearing, where Dick and his lawyers fought back. They accused Jim of targeting them unfairly, but the evidence was damning. No permits, no studies, no compliance. The hearing board sided with the FAA. Dick's face was a mask of rage as he stormed out. That night, Jim got a threatening voicemail. "You'll regret this, Harrison," a disguised voice said. Jim saved it, handing it to the FBI. The HOA was desperate, and desperate people made mistakes. The fight was consuming Jim's life. He missed planting season, his fields lying fallow. Liz handled what she could, but the farm suffered. Neighbors, once friendly, now whispered about the FAA tyrant. Even his kids, grown and living elsewhere, called worried. "Dad, is this worth it?" his daughter asked. Jim didn't have an easy answer. The farm was his soul, but the fight was his duty. He couldn't let the HOA win, not just for him, but for every small farmer, every underdog crushed by wealth and power. Still, the pressure was relentless. The HOA's lawyers filed a countersuit, claiming Jim's actions were a conflict of interest. They demanded his resignation from the FAA. Jim laughed it off publicly, but privately wondered if he'd gone too far. One night, Liz found him in the barn, staring at an old photo of his father. "He'd be proud of you," she said. Jim shook his head. "He'd tell me to focus on the farm, not some vendetta." Liz took his hand. "This isn't a vendetta. It's justice." Her words steadied him. The next day, he met with Senator Reynolds, who offered to pull strings. "I can get the lawsuit quashed," Tom said. Jim declined. "I want to win this fair." But fairness was a luxury. The HOA's next move was personal. They bribed a local official to rezone part of Jim's farm, threatening foreclosure. Jim countered with a call to the state attorney general, exposing the bribe. The official was arrested and the rezoning halted. The HOA was running out of moves, but Jim knew they wouldn't stop. Not yet. Jim's trump card was the environmental angle. The runway's construction had disrupted a nearby wetland, home to endangered species. He tipped off the EPA, who launched an investigation. Inspectors found violations galore: chemical runoff, habitat destruction, unreported waste. The fines were astronomical, and the HOA's budget buckled. Dick, desperate, called a secret meeting with his inner circle. "We need dirt on Harrison," he said. They hired a private investigator, but Jim's life was clean. Too clean. The PI found nothing but a man who loved his farm and his country. Meanwhile, Jim's FAA team uncovered more. The HOA had falsified documents to secure funding for the runway. The FBI took interest, and Dick's name came up in a wiretap. He was panicking, and Jim could smell blood. At the farm, Jim and Liz began replanting, a symbolic act of defiance. The community was watching now, some even offering help. The tide was turning. Jim held a press conference, laying out the HOA's violations in stark detail. The media, once skeptical, ate it up. "Local farmer takes on corrupt HOA" became the headline. Dick's empire was collapsing, but he had one last card, a direct appeal to the FAA's oversight board, claiming Jim's actions were biased. Jim welcomed the scrutiny. He presented his case, hundreds of pages of evidence, all airtight. The board ruled in his favor, upholding the runway's shutdown. Dick was finished, and the HOA was facing dissolution. With the runway dead, Jim focused on healing his farm. Volunteers from the community, some former HOA members, helped replant. The fields, though scarred, began to green again. Liz organized a community barbecue, a peace offering to those who'd turned against Dick. Jim spoke to the crowd, not as the FAA director, but as a farmer. "This land is ours," he said. "Not just mine, but all of ours." The applause was tentative at first, then thunderous. Dick, meanwhile, faced charges: fraud, bribery, environmental crimes. His McMansion was foreclosed, his reputation ruined. Karen Wilson moved away, unable to face the neighbors she'd bullied. The HOA elected a new board, one that promised transparency. Jim watched it all, feeling not triumph but relief. Back at the FAA, Jim considered stepping down. The fight had exposed him, made him a target, but Sarah convinced him otherwise. "You're the best director we've had," she said. "You fought for what's right." Jim stayed, but he set boundaries. The farm came first now. He delegated more, spent evenings with Liz, watching the sunset over their fields. The HOA's runway was dismantled, the concrete broken up and recycled. The land would heal just as Jim had. But the scars remained, a reminder of what he'd almost lost and what he'd gained. Years later, the farm was thriving. Jim and Liz expanded, turning part of the land into a community garden. Former HOA residents, now neighbors, worked alongside them, learning to plant and harvest. Jim's story had spread, inspiring others to stand up to overreach. He wrote a book, Fields and Skies, about balancing his dual life. It became a bestseller, though he stayed humble. At the FAA, he pushed for reforms to protect rural communities from aviation overreach, ensuring no one else faced what he had. One evening, as he and Liz sat on the porch, a plane flew overhead, not a private jet, but a crop duster helping a neighbor. Jim smiled. The skies were his, but so was the land. He'd fought for both and won. The fight had changed him, made him see the power of community. The HOA's defeat wasn't just his victory. It was a lesson for all. Wealth and arrogance could be toppled by principle and persistence. As the sun set, casting gold over the fields, Liz leaned against him. "Worth it?" she asked. Jim nodded. "Every damn second." Their laughter echoed, a promise of peace reclaimed, a legacy preserved, and a future bright with possibility.